This week I had a chance to go see The Dark Tower starring Idris Elba and Matthew McConaughey. Now this is two great actors in a movie together, so let's see what happens. Hey guys, I'm Ryan Lavin and I review movies to help you manage your expectations so when you walk out of the theater, you're not left disappointed. So The Dark Tower is a Stephen King adaptation of a series of books that go by the same name. They follow this kid named Jake that's having these dreams about this other world. Now in these dreams, he's seeing this man in black trying to take down some tower and a bunch of gunslingers standing in his way. Well, turns out his dreams are real and he gets sucked into the middle of it all. Now, my expectations going into this really weren't that great. I'd seen the trailers, but to be honest, they weren't all that interesting to me. Plus, I'd heard there had been some problems along the way. Now, generally speaking, I really like movies that introduce us to these new fantasy worlds, as long as they take the time to develop those worlds and make sure they feel like they've been lived in. The problem is a lot of movies don't take the time to do that anymore. So I've learned over the years not to hold my breath anytime a trailer introduces me to this new mythological world. Surprisingly, world building really wasn't one of my issues. While you don't get a lot of information about this place, there are hints at a much deeper mythology resting just beneath the surface, whether it be through something you see in the background or something you hear in passing in the middle of a much larger conversation. So although you're not given a lot of information, you still feel the weight of its history, even if you don't get to see it. Now, admittedly, some of that history I could have done without. One thing movies do frequently that just really bother me is when they begin to provide a new context for our own history or our own mythology. One example of this is the latest Transformers movie where they tied everything to King Arthur. Another example is Captain America when you have the Red Skull shooting laser guns in the middle of World War II. Now, there is one point where Matthew McConaughey does a little bit of this, but the truth is he doesn't elaborate a whole lot on it. It's not significant to the plot, so it's easy enough for me to ignore. After hearing about some of the concerns people had about the movie and knowing how elaborate this world could be, I was a little worried I might get lost along the way. But I didn't. Now, don't get me wrong, there's plenty of unanswered questions, but none of them are vital to the story, even if it does require you to suspend your disbelief a little bit. I'll give you a perfect example. If you've seen the trailer, you know there's a point where the narrator begins to recite the Gunslinger's creed as Idris Elba takes out his gun and shoots a guy without looking. Now, when I saw that scene for the first time, it gave me the impression there was some kind of mythological force associated with the Gunslingers. But there's not. They're just really good shots. As a matter of fact, they're too good. It reminds me of that movie Wanted that came out in 2008. I felt like it was cheesy back then. It's just lazy now. Now, on a more positive note, I really did enjoy some of the humor. Now, it's your typical fish out of water humor, but it worked for me. I laughed quite a bit. But that also brings me to one of my bigger negatives. Now, this revolves a little bit around a plot point. I'm not going to go into specifics. I'm going to keep things as general as possible. So I'll say this. There's one point where the gunslinger has to go from point A to point B. And there's this big, long debate about why they can't do that and all the consequences that would come as a result of it. So instead, they decide to go from point A to point C, from point C to point B. Here's the problem. All the consequences that would have happened between going from point A and point B also apply to going from point A and point C. And all that stuff they were worried about ends up happening anyway. So I don't really understand what the advantage was. And as much as that bothered me, that's not even the biggest negative. The biggest negative I have about the movie is I feel like Matthew McConaughey was just miscast. Now, that doesn't mean he's bad in this role. It simply means I feel like he's far too recognizable. Now, it's pretty clear that they're going for a character that is meant to be very cool and collected, someone who's not overly emotional. And when I think about characters like that, the one that comes to mind is President Snow from the Hunger Games. And I feel like that's what you want. You want someone who has presence, someone who can communicate boiling hatred just beneath the surface with a smile on their face. And that's just not him. At least not at this point in his career. So this is one of those movies that falls into a gray area for me. I feel like it's put together pretty well. It has some compelling moments and even holds my attention, but there's just not enough there for me to love. So I will say The Dark Tower is easily a guilty pleasure. If you need a refresher on my rating system, just check the description box below. And while you're there, why don't you leave me a comment? Let me know if you think The Dark Tower is a movie that deserves a sequel, or would you rather see another Stephen King adaptation? And as always, if you've made it to this point in the video, that means you must have liked it. So why don't you go ahead and give it a thumbs up and make sure you hit the subscribe button on your way out so you're kept up to date next time I get ready to upload a new video.